2-0 up.
Well, that's true, but there are ministers who have resigned even before he was announced as the winner today because they don't feel they can support his do-or-die attitude when it comes to...
Yeah, I'm listening to the BBC radio, which is being rebroadcast by East Stroudsburg University's own radio station, the MTV Woody Award-winning radio station. Yeah, we won that award for being the best college radio station in the country. And I'm listening to that radio station broadcasting the BBC World Service, the world's most prestigious news service, heard in 45 languages across the world, and broadcasting that, and I'm listening to it on my computer. And isn't that strange, really? I mean, you guys do this all day long if you want to. You listen on your phones, listen on your computer. But the idea of sound coming out of an electronic box, pretty crazy idea, right? And that's how we're going to head into today's subject matter, because we're going to be talking about Chapter 7, I think it is. Yeah, Chapter 7, which is on audio. It could be called radio. In fact, in some of the earlier versions of this book, it was called radio, this chapter, but it's strictly on audio. And so we're going to take a look at how audio has developed as a technology and how it, again, has impacted the way that we think, believe, and feel in American society. And I don't need to tell you to start things off that the tools that the average person has today to both listen to audio and create audio are amazing. I mean, so many of my students are creating music, and they're the only person creating the music. They're doing all the drums, they're doing brass if they have that, they're doing the vocals, of course. They're producing everything, sometimes just on an iPhone. They're producing an entire song. It's just amazing. So producing music has never been easier. Today it's also heightened the competition as well because so many people can do it. You don't need a studio anymore. Although having that and having a producer and having professional technicians and audio engineers is obviously going to give you a much better chance to become a Bruno Mars. But for the most part, everybody can produce music if they want. They can produce audio, which is not just music, it's also speech. A lot of people do podcasts, for example. On the consumption side of things, there's so many places to get audio today. You can get your computer and your phone, they just serve as a kind of a portal to audio. You can go to Spotify, Pandora, YouTube, your own collection of music. You can just go on the web and just do a search in YouTube, see what you want to find audio-wise. So there's a plethora of choices of audio today. But at the same time, as I kind of hinted at, it's really, really difficult to break into the competition. I have a student in a band called the Love Zombies. You can look them up if you want to. Her name, what's her name? Hollis, Hollis is her stage name now. It used to be Holly when she was here at ESU. And she's been trying probably for about 20 years to make it with her band, the Love Zombies. In California, they play, I think they're in the UK right now. They're playing, going around the UK. It is really tough. And she is still struggling because I see her posts on Facebook and she's working jobs in LA that are in the retail industry trying to break through. She hasn't quit. She's got a lot of perseverance, but that's how tough it is to break it into music today because radio is that venue that plays new music for most people. It's not the only venue, but it's the biggest medium that does that. And radio is very, very conservative. It only wants to air hits. It only wants to air what is already proven according to a formula. So that's a backdrop for today. Now let's head into the history of sound recording. This is where audio comes from, the history of sound recording. And I want you to consider that before there was the mass consumption of music, because that's what we're going to be talking about today, is not sitting listening to a piano player in your salon, which is the way the music went on before. But now we're looking at music that everybody can hear, not just if you're in that space. So before there was music, people had to play live, right? You played around singing around a piano. I'm sorry, before there was audio, people had to play music live. They had to sit around a piano. You had to listen to a person with a violin. If somebody sang, there was no way of capturing that. Well, that all changed when we start to head now into highlighting another person over the next few classes as this person enters into the invention world of mass media. We're leaving behind Ben Franklin. Now we're mentioning Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison, known as the U.S.'s greatest inventor, and he's got his museum not too far from here, just outside of New York City. You can go over to see the Edison Museum. And what he invented was a foil cylinder, kind of like a paper towel roll, if you think of it that way, with foil wrapped around it. And he found that he could actually store information on that. And if he took a needle and applied it to the foil and rotated the foil and applied an electrical charge, that he could produce sound. And so he actually produced the very first musical recording and that was Mary Had a Little Lamb. That was the first recording, first official audio recording. And it took us inventors, by the way, he had a whole team of inventors. It took them 10 months to come up with this invention, which he called the phonograph. The phonograph. So then that invention, like all inventions in this class that are mass media inventions, they get built upon and modified by other people. So next along comes a German. His name is Emil, E-M-I-L-E, Berliner. He's from Germany, and he invents what he calls the gramophone. And the gramophone, instead of using a cylinder, instead started to use discs. Originally they were made out of zinc, and then later they became vinyl discs. And so Emil Berliner is the one that changed the way that music is both rotated back and also the medium on which it's stored. But eventually all of these machines that would reproduce audio, they all started to adopt the name phonograph. So gramophone went away, and phonograph, Thomas Edison's name, came to discuss any playback device for audio. So now things start to go very quickly. Let's highlight another stage in the development of this medium. 1935, we get the development of what we call high fidelity or hi-fi. And that's a major development in audio because what it does is it opens up the recorded song, which previously, I mean, you might need to be a little bit of a musician to understand this or understand music theory, but the original music as it was recorded had a very strong mid-range, but not many highs and not many lows. The song was hovering around that middle part of the pitch scale and was muffled. So hi-fi changed all of that. Hi-fi, this sounds similar to Wi-Fi, right? Now we see where we borrow language rules from earlier versions of languages used to describe media. Hi-fi or high fidelity opens up the treble, and it opens up the bass, it opens up the song, the music itself. After that, we get magnetic tapes. I'll show you one since most of you have never seen these before. Magnetic tapes, they come in a number of different sizes. These ones are reel-to-reel tapes, R-E-E-L, R-E-E-L, reel-to-reel. There's also cassette tapes, and eventually along comes digital audio tapes. It was another medium for storing audio information on it. Yeah, before the hard disk came along, right? So that happened in 1949, magnetic tapes. And what they allowed for was better sound recording. The complexity of music is played back better on this medium than prior mediums for recording. And also it allowed you to edit easier because you could physically take a razor blade and cut a piece out of the tape and put it later on the tape. And then also it allowed tapes for a new kind of recording that we're going to be highlighting later in the class called multi-track sound recording, where you can actually divide up the tape and you can put one track going this direction. That track might be bass, and another track going this direction, which is drums, and another one this with vocals and guitar, so on. All right, 1 second, please. I'm in the middle of my video lecture. I'll just continue. I'll be done. All right, adjunct professor would like to talk to me. So next, I want to talk about transmitting music and talk. And it's really going to be about the birth of radio. That's what we're talking about here. And so I want you to think about this thought. It's pretty profound in my opinion. And that is, prior to radio, which is an electronic way of communicating information, prior to radio, if you were going to communicate across big distances, that communication had to be transported. It had to be carried. It had to be moved, physically carried across the mountains in the form of a letter or a newspaper or a book. That all changes. That all changes with the telegraph, which I'll describe in a moment, and then radio, which essentially breaks through the barrier of space when it comes to communicating and mass communication. So here's how it all starts. 1844, you have a person named Samuel Morse. He comes from the Army. You might recognize his name as in Morse code. And he invented the telegraph. And the telegraph was used to transmit messages using Morse code, which is a series of dots and dashes. So a telegraph operates kind of like a stapler. You go and it's on a hard line. It goes from San Francisco down to Los Angeles, and the railroad operator could say the train has just left the station. It's 5 minutes late. It's going to be there 5 minutes later. Yeah, that's what telegraph was largely used for. It had had other applications as well, the U.S. Navy, for example, and became part of the security apparatus for the United States. But it broke the barrier of space because the person in San Francisco can talk to the person in L.A. in real time, even though they are hundreds of miles away from each other. 1866 is the next date that I would like to highlight. 1844, Sam Morse invented the telegraph. But in 1866, we have the completion of the telegraph cable that goes under the Atlantic Ocean, and now we connect the United States to Europe. So now we can start to use that cable for other things as well, like phone calls. So we're really seeing a rapid development of electronic communication once the telegraph gets born. And in 1888 now, moving up another 40 years, we have an inventor. He was a physicist by the name of Heinrich Hertz. Same last name as you see for the car rental company. And Hertz, if you know electronics, you hear something is measured in gigahertz or megahertz. That's his name being applied because he was a physicist, and he actually theorized, drawing theories on a board, that it would be possible to communicate over the air. Now, how crazy of an idea must that have been before it happened? It's like today we're thinking about whether we can ever communicate in holograms. And, in 50 years, maybe that's what we'll be doing and won't think twice about it. But his idea was really novel. He drew up what he called radio waves. And he only developed a theory. He didn't actually develop the technology. That came along in 1894, just a few years later after that. And it was an Italian, Guglielmo Marconi. He was an Italian, I should say, Guglielmo Marconi. And he created what he called the wireless telegraph. So isn't it interesting? We're still borrowing terminology today to describe our phones based on radio technology. We talk about Wi-Fi, wireless. It's coming from radio. Yeah, the wireless telegraph. You don't need a cable coming out of the back of this anymore because he invented a little transmitter. And he thought he would use it for point-to-point communication. And he demonstrated how powerful this new invention was by doing a transmission all the way from England to northern Canada. Yeah, to Newfoundland, up on the East Coast. A radio signal all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. But still, the kind of information that was being transmitted were dots and dashes. They weren't voice, it wasn't music going across the airwaves, and that changed in 1901. 1901, you have a physicist by the name of Reginald Fessenden. Reginald Fessenden, he started finding out a way to send voice signals on the radio. And so now all of a sudden you have the ability of a medium electronically to transmit voice, and then later music comes along as well. The next person I want to highlight is somebody by the name of David Sarnoff. We're going to follow him because he's going to develop a company. So David Sarnoff, he worked for the U.S. Navy, actually, and he has a famous place in history. He was on the Carpathia boat, which is the boat that was called to the site where the Titanic sank. And he was, I forget his position on that boat, but he was in charge of radio communications, sending information back to New York to let people know that the survivors of the Titanic were on their way. Then he went into that field, right after the Navy, he went into the radio field, and he started working for the Marconi Company. Yeah, Marconi started a whole company, and he started working for that. And in his capacity working for that company, he wrote what is now known as the famous Radio Music Box Memo. David Sarnoff wrote the Radio Music Box Memo. And what he did was he argued that this medium of radio, which prior to that was a point-to-point medium, like you pick up a phone call and call one person, that's what radio was, transmitting from one person to another person, he envisioned it to be a mass medium, a medium capable of reaching many people at the same time. So he wrote this memo, and he argued in it that radio could become a household utility. A household utility, it's a completely different conceptualization of radio. It's saying that it should be like electricity or like water or sewer. It's something that is in the house on a daily basis that you need for the household to operate. And in fact, radios made their way into people's households, and they started to arrange their living rooms around them. They had the couch, and right behind the couch was the big radio receiver. It's huge, like a TV. And the whole family would sit in there and organize their living room around that device. So in a way, he was right. The music box radio is really predicting the idea that there could be a thing, a physical thing that music comes out of. It's the radio receiver that we call it today. So you could say that David Sarnoff is the first person to conceptualize radio as a social medium. Yes, we talk about social media today, but radio, the original social medium, because more people, many people are listening to it at the same time. Now, unfortunately, RCA is a company that comes along, and the reason that it comes along is because World War II forces the Navy, it believes, to seize all of the radio technology patents that were out there because of government secrets getting out and this new technology being used in the hands of the enemy. So the government seized all those patents. But the American people never too happy with the U.S. government owning things, especially potential technology businesses. That didn't last for long. So what happened was the government allowed the creation of a company called RCA, Radio Corporation of America, and radio took over the patents of radio and also took over the development of radio. And this company was unique because it was formed out of a bunch of other companies. And those other companies included General Electric, the same company that may make your refrigerator at home. AT&T, you may have your cell phone service with that today. Also, by the way, that stands for the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. Westinghouse Company, which is no longer in existence. That's the first one. That's the company that started the first radio station in the U.S., KDKA. And then there's a wild card company called the United Fruit Company, which was down in the Caribbean and South America, taking advantage of those developing countries, pulling bananas and other produce out of there, and they needed radio communication to communicate with people working on the plantations. So these companies came together to form RCA to keep it in the hands of American interests. And as I mentioned earlier, the very first broadcast was actually by a Westinghouse company, KDKA, and it was from Pittsburgh on the top of a building during the 1920 presidential elections. Almost right away, radio was a commercial medium. We've said in this class already that media in this class started out almost exclusively as private media. They're profit-making media, and radio was that way too. There was a toll that was sold on a radio station called WEAF, a toll that was sold to AT&T. If AT&T wants to carry its name on the station, it has to pay a toll to get on there. That's the way that went. All right, let's talk about the formation of the very first radio network. It was in 1928. A network is where you have one studio in New York usually, and it produces the content and then sends it out to all the affiliate networked radio stations or TV stations, because we also have that as well. So William Paley was the first one to form a network called CBS, formed it in 1928. I mentioned in a previous class that he formed this network only to advertise his cigars. That's why it's called the Columbia Broadcasting System. That was the name of his cigar business, Columbia Cigars. So he bought radio stations just so he could advertise them. Other networks formed around the same time. NBC formed a few years later, and NBC was more about the listeners. It was about trying to serve listeners. All right, so now we have to depart from radio as we go into television, because television, like radio, is developing parallel to newspapers. In the previous class, television is developing parallel to radio. So let's also mention that in the 1920s to the 1940s, before we get quite to radio, to TV, let's just make the point that those years were radio's golden age, the 20s to the 40s. That's when the best programs were produced. That's when the most expensive actors were hired. That's where the best talent and resources were used in radio. And you had all these radio shows, dramas, you had science fiction, you had entertainment, you had news, you even had sports. Mysteries, westerns, every genre that you can imagine that exists on Netflix today, you have this genre on radio, the 1920s through the 1940s. But that all crashes down in the 1950s because television comes on the scene, and programs like The Lone Ranger, Hi-Yo Silver, I don't know if you've ever seen that. Why would anybody want to listen to that on the radio when you can actually see The Lone Ranger on television? So radio lost a lot of its audience during the 1950s. They migrated over to television. And television also presented at that time a dilemma for radio. It looked like it was going to fail. Radio lost 90% of its audiences, the advertising dollars, the actors. And so it struggled during the 1950s. And then finally in the 1960s, it reinvented itself. Remember, we've talked about how media reinvent themselves. Well, radio reinvented itself with format radio. In the 1960s, format radio said, no longer are we going to do every kind of genre of acting out there. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to pick one kind of music, and it's going to be very narrow because it's going to go after a very, very small audience, and we're just trying to get to that audience. We're just going to do news. We're just going to do top 40 hits to go after females 18 to 25. That was the formula that propelled radio into the future. Niche radio. Don't try to get the biggest audience, just try to get an audience. So what happens next is we start to see a fundamental change in American society because of music. Music and youth culture, which starts to rise up in the 60s because the baby boom generation is just a big bubble of young people that were born in the 50s and the 60s, so they have a lot more power just numbers-wise. And music infuses them with feelings of freedom, growing their hair long, and defying old conventions like marriage and saving sex for marriage. And all of this stuff starts at war and religion are questioned. This is all in large part due to the lyrics of music and the musicians that started to be broadcast on radio and in people's phonographs, their home phonographs, and we have really a fundamental change in American society, you can say largely due to audio, or more specific, radio. And part of the change that took place was a racial change in this country. So before 1948, there were a lot of recordings by black musicians because in the United States, we have a rich tradition of African-American music, still have it today with rap, right? But back then it was more blues and later some beginnings of rock and roll. These records were known as race records because they were by black musicians. And in fact, black musicians in the beginning, they couldn't even have their music aired on radio because the white audience was not said to be accepting of that. So you start to have white musicians that are recording black songs. And the most famous, of course, musician of that is Elvis Presley, this guy right here.
Infections, taking plasma patient X-ray, sequence the DNA of the parasites, looking their genome, looking to keep their hybridization, and see how they're spreading.
Here goes Elvis the Pelvis. All right, so I'm also introducing some other commentary on Elvis Presley there. He was known as Elvis the Pelvis, as I said there. He was starting to sexualize music. And in fact, in the beginning, he wasn't even allowed to be shown from the waist up because his pelvis was said to be too sexual and the people in the audience were going crazy. But Elvis Presley was not actually a real musician. I guess some people might disagree with that, but he didn't write songs. He recorded songs, and he did songs because he looked, well, he didn't look, but he sounded a little bit like black music. And so he was a white face for black music. But that changed, started to change. It took a while, still in a process, because along comes next is Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry, many people consider him, myself included, to be the real father of rock and roll. And he's the first African-American playing a guitar, and really well. Yeah, Chuck Berry there, Johnny Be Good, is the name of that song. So we start to see music. You can hear the crowd there, right? That's just a live crowd, and you can imagine the impact of music as a whole as people are listening to it in their cars all day long, getting together at sock hops and milkshake stands, et cetera, et cetera. So now let's trace how music itself starts to change through various genres. So the first genre we're going to talk about is the Motown genre. The Motown genre coming out of Motortown, USA, or Detroit. And this is a very African-American-based music. Gospel singers are playing in there. The most famous performers were Marvin Gaye and the Supremes. It had a very specific sound. It's known as Motown, Motortown. Then another genre we have is the British Invasion. The British Invasion are all these super rock groups coming over from Britain in the 1960s and 1970s, including the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, who I'm going to see August the 5th in New Jersey in a couple weeks, and The Who, and Led Zeppelin, Hollies, other bands as well. At this time in the 60s, live shows started to become very big because of technology as well, because the speakers allowed artists to project their songs to the back of a football stadium. So now you have the technology of audio and the reproduction of sound making audio expansive in terms of its live reach. And it's no surprise then that we start to have shows that start to incorporate theatrics of costuming and gimmicks and special effects. We also have concept albums that are being recorded in the studio. Moving away from the live venue now, in the studio we have the ability to record music in multi-track fashion. And what that means is you can record one track and then you can come back and over the top of that you record the second track, and over the top you record the third track. So it allows you to record some of the song in London and then you can take the rest to LA and add a saxophone, for example. And that's all possible in the 1960s because of the technology of music. So music becomes much more complex, much more expansive during the 1960s and beyond. Now let's go to country music. Country music known, well, I guess you could say that's America's music today. Country music as a form of music came out of Irish and Scottish music. And it also combined Christian gospel. Some of it came out of the Appalachian Mountains, some of it came from the South. It was originally known as hillbilly music. And then it became country music that was popular to the masses because of MTV. This is not talked about in the book. Garth Brooks was one of the artists who helped this become a reality. Country music used to be a twangy guitar located in just the South of the United States. But when it went to MTV, it started to use, quote, beautiful performers, like we still see that today with Taylor Swift, for example. And also country music started to incorporate sounds of rock and roll, not the twangy guitar so much as the slide guitar. So country started to have crossover appeal, and that's when it broke out of the South and became, you could say in a way, America's music. Now I'd like to move to concerns that people have about young people's music that they're listening to, and this includes rap today. There's a lot of concerns about the effects of music, particularly on young people who are vulnerable. It could be drug use, it could be early sex, it could be the treatment of women, misogynist treatment of women, if you know that word. You can treat them like hoes. You know, there's a lot of talk in rock and roll and a lot of talk in rap that is asked about, does it get people into drugs? Does it get people to have sex early? Does it get people to be violent? Does it get people to idolize a gangster lifestyle? That's for you to consider. All right, so this chapter ends with some comments about analog and digital recording, but I'm up about the limit that I want to get to in my video today, so I'm going to leave you to read that on your own. And in the meantime, I hope that you tap into your own knowledge about audio recording as you listen to it on the internet, because you're more well-versed than me in that, and that will show you where radio and audio are today. Have a great day.